Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Batman the Killing Joke. Now, this is a graphic novel written by Alan Moore and illustrated by Brian Bolland, and of course published by DC Comics, and of course featuring the character of Batman, who was originally created by Bob Kane and Bill Finger. Now, I do want to point out that I did already do a review on this, actually back when I first started doing these Batman reviews, but I wanted to redo it. Now, The Killing Joke was published in 1988, and I would say this, and Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, and Grant Morrison's Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on Serious Earth, I would say those three comics are the comics that really showed, at least mainstream readers, that the character of Batman can be taken seriously, and they really sort of geared Batman comics and comics in general more towards adult readers. And they also showed that you could do some really interesting storytelling with a character like Batman. Now, I find the evolution of Batman to be pretty interesting. If you look at the original Batman comics from Bob Kane and Bill Finger, when they first started out, they were actually relatively dark. Like, they were written to be sort of like these dark crime stories. I mean, they were still a little cheesy by today's standards, and you could argue that they were still intended for kids. But over time, Batman comics started getting progressively sillier and sillier, especially by the 50s and 60s, and then you had the Adam West Batman show, which wasn't even remotely meant to be taken seriously. But then by the 70s and early 80s, the comics started to get darker again and started becoming a lot more character-driven. But then by the late 80s, Frank Miller really sort of reinvented the character with The Dark Knight Returns and Batman Year One. And Frank Miller, for all intents and purposes, really did sort of create the dark and gritty Batman story. And I think Alan Moore with this book was sort of picking up where Frank Miller left off in a lot of regards in terms of sort of reinventing certain things that we think about when we think about Batman. Or more specifically, he sort of reinvented certain things that we think about when we think about the Joker. Now, another reason why I hold this book and The Dark Knight Returns and Arkham Asylum on par with each other is, even though they're all set in the Batman mythos, all three of these books feel very self-contained to a certain extent. Like, The Dark Knight Returns is really a dystopian novel that just happens to feature Batman and other characters from the Batman mythos, just like Arkham Asylum is really a psychological horror story that just happens to feature Batman. It's kind of the same thing with this one, because this book is really a psychological drama that just happens to feature Batman and Jim Gordon and the Joker. Now, Alan Moore also wrote graphic novels like Watchmen, which is considered by many, myself included, to be the greatest graphic novel ever written. He also wrote V for Vendetta and From Hell, and as much as Alan Moore might not appreciate me saying this, because I know he doesn't think very highly of this story, but honestly, I would rank this right alongside those works as one of his best books. Alan Moore also reinvented the character of Swamp Thing with his run on that series, and he also wrote the comic book series, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. Now, the plot of The Killing Joke is you realize that all these years of fighting the Joker has really started to get to Batman on a psychological level. And Batman realizes that this craziness can't go on much longer because he knows that eventually it's going to get to the point where one of them is going to kill the other, and he doesn't want it to get to that. So he goes to Arkham Asylum to confront the Joker and make an attempt to reason with him, only to find out that the Joker has escaped. So what happens is the Joker ends up crippling Barbara Gordon, who of course is Batgirl, and then he kidnaps Jim Gordon, and throughout the course of the story, he humiliates and psychologically tortures Jim Gordon because he's trying to drive Jim Gordon insane. And the reason the Joker is doing this is because he's trying to prove a point. He's trying to prove that all it takes is one bad day to set a seemingly perfectly normal person over the edge, and he's trying to prove this point that we as a species are inherently insane. And he's trying to break not just Jim Gordon, but Batman as well. But I think The Killing Joke is an excellent graphic novel. Not just as a Batman graphic novel, but as a graphic novel in general. I think this is really good. And there's a reason this is considered to be one of the greatest Batman stories ever written, and is also considered to be probably the greatest Joker story ever written. And something that makes this story actually really fucked up and really disturbing is the fact that the Joker commits these unforgivable crimes in this story, and he does things where you wouldn't blame Batman for outright killing this guy. Like, he shoots Barbara Gordon in the spine, and it doesn't say it flat out, but it heavily implies that he might have sexually molested her, and even if he didn't do that, he definitely humiliated her. But what makes it really fucked up is Alan Moore presents the Joker as actually a very tragic character, and he presents him with this backstory where you totally understand why this guy went insane, and you find yourself sympathizing with the Joker when you know you shouldn't after all the horrible things that he's done. But here's the thing about his backstory. It's only a suggested backstory. At one point, the Joker outright says that sometimes he remembers it one way and sometimes he remembers it another way, and he also says, if I were to have a past, I prefer it to be multiple choice. Now, my personal interpretation is that the Joker doesn't know where he came from, and he only created this backstory for himself to sort of justify, at least to himself, why he does what he does. But even if that backstory isn't true, I would still argue that the Joker is a tragic character in this story, because imagine how horrible that would be not to know who you are and not to know where you came from. But it leaves you conflicted because it's like, how can I sympathize with this guy after the horrible things that he's done? And in this backstory for the Joker, which may or may not be real, all it took was one bad day to set him over the edge, and when you think about Batman's backstory, all it was one bad day that set Batman over the edge, and Batman, when you really stop to think about it, even though he is the good guy, he's technically freaking insane, because this is a guy who's running around dressed up like a giant bat, kicking the shit out of people he doesn't like. Technically, he's just as crazy as the enemies that he fights. And basically what Alan Moore is doing with this story is he's saying that on a philosophical level, Batman and the Joker are essentially the same person. They're two sides of the same coin. They're essentially mirror images of each other. And that's something that Alan Moore does so brilliantly, is he really does sort of break down the concept of superheroes, but he also analyzes them on a philosophical level and also sort of a realistic level where he's basically asking, okay, what would it be like if these so-called superheroes actually existed? In that sense, you could very much compare this to Watchmen. Another way you could compare these two books is the Joker's philosophy in this story is actually very similar to the comedian's philosophy in Watchmen. Like, the Joker in this story has a very nihilistic philosophy. He essentially views human existence as a giant cosmic joke. Like, you kind of get the idea that the way he sees it is, in this age of nuclear weapons and pollution, we are essentially a doomed species, and the only sane way to cope with this is insanity. Now, this book is set in the mainstream Batman continuity, and what happens to Barbara Gordon in this story leads to her becoming Oracle in later Batman comics, but I almost feel like this story is kind of hurt by being set in the main continuity. Because the way this story ends, if this were set in its own timeline, you could draw so many different interpretations from the ending, but because this is set in the main continuity, you pretty much know what happens afterwards. That's why the way I look at it is, even though this is part of the mainstream DC continuity, if you wanted to, you could also place this in its own timeline. So, looking at the story as being set in its own self-contained universe, the way you could interpret the ending of the story is maybe Batman actually went insane by the end of the story, or maybe because the Joker does admit that he's past redemption at the end of the story, but there is sort of this implication that maybe there will be some kind of resolve, maybe there will be some kind of end to the chaos. Where the story is kind of helped by being set in the main continuity is, even though there's this brief period of calm by the end of the story, you know it doesn't last, so it's sort of this idea that Batman and the Joker are sort of trapped in this personal hell of their own creation. But again, it really is a brilliant comic, and there are so many of these interesting little moments in the story, like, at one point you see Harvey Dent, and I feel like that appearance from Harvey Dent was done on purpose, because when you think about the idea of one bad day fucking up your entire life, Harvey Dent almost fits into that more than the Joker. There's also another brilliant moment in the story where the Joker is reaching for his wife in this flashback, but then it cuts to present day where he's just reaching for this clown in one of those, like, fortune teller boxes, and you could say that maybe this image of the clown in the fortune teller box kind of reminded him of this memory of his wife, or it could be this image of the clown in the fortune teller box actually sort of just triggered off this fake memory. Another interesting kind of fourth wall breaking moment in the story is Batman looks down at a picture and it's actually a Bob Kane drawing of the old Batman from the 50s. I thought that moment was interesting because this is obviously not set in the same continuity as those older Batman comics. At least I don't think it is, because this was written after DC rebooted the timeline of their universe. Also, it would be kind of hard to take this story seriously if it was set in the same continuity as those goofier Batman stories. But I feel like that moment symbolically was supposed to be Batman reflecting back on simpler times. I also saw that moment as Alan Moore and Brian Bolland sort of making a statement about how dark comic books were becoming at this point, but it's ironic that they're making a statement like that in what is arguably one of the darkest comic books ever written. I also think Brian Bolland's artwork in this comic is fantastic, and the artwork has sort of a timeless quality to it, because something I've noticed in a lot of comics I've read in the 80s is you could tell they were drawn in the 80s. Just like you could tell comics drawn in the 90s were drawn in the 90s, and you could tell comics drawn today were drawn today. The same thing with, like, the 50s and 60s. You could tell comic books from back then were drawn at that time. But as I said, I feel like Brian Bolland's artwork has a real timeless quality about it, but there are little callbacks to Bob Kane's artwork in here. Now, this edition of The Killing Joke comes with a bonus story at the end of it, written and illustrated by Brian Bolland, and this one is unconnected with The Killing Joke. It's just a short little story about some guy having a fantasy about killing Batman, but it is pretty cool. But yeah, I cannot recommend The Killing Joke enough. I definitely think this is one of the best Batman stories, and as much as Alan Moore might not like this story, I do think this is one of Alan Moore's best books. And also, I certainly do not recommend this for kids, but that should have kind of gone without saying, based on how I described this book. Now, this comic also had a huge influence on so many Batman comics that would follow this. Like, the more that I think about it, I would almost consider Grant Morrison's Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on Serious Earth, to be sort of a spiritual sequel to this, because that comic also deals with a lot of the same themes. The idea that Batman and the enemies that he fights are really just mirror images of each other, and the idea that Batman is just as crazy as his villains. And then you had other Joker stories like Brian Azzarello's Joker and Kevin Smith's Cacophony and Scott Snyder's Death of the Family, which were all clearly inspired by this story. Now, both this book and The Dark Knight Returns, for all intents and purposes, led to Tim Burton's Batman. In fact, Tim Burton has actually said that this was his favorite Batman comic. And also the darker, more serious Batman story that was established in this and The Dark Knight Returns and Arkham Asylum really did sort of set the template for Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy. And you could definitely see where the Joker from this comic inspired Heath Ledger's Joker, especially the whole aspect of him not knowing his own backstory, and every time he explains his backstory in that movie, it's a different backstory. And also, certain aspects of the Joker's philosophy in that movie you could tell was inspired by this comic. And this graphic novel also had an animated film adaptation in 2016, which I personally thought sucked. One of the biggest issues with the movie is because the graphic novel really isn't that long. If they were to adapt the graphic novel straight, it would probably be only like 40 or 45 minutes long, so I understand why they added a lot of stuff, but what they did with it was, because Barbara Gordon had such a horrible fate in this story, they tried to very much make it her movie. The issue with it was like the first half of the movie was very much about Barbara Gordon, but it didn't connect with the kill and joke segments of the movie at all. It would be one thing if, like, maybe the Barbara Gordon part of the movie had some kind of parallel with the kill and joke stuff, but it really didn't, and I actually found the way they handled Barbara Gordon in the movie to be kind of insulting to the character. Now, to be fair to that movie, the parts of that film that were adapting the novel straight actually did a pretty good job. The issue was, I didn't think Mark Hamill's voice... Now, don't get me wrong, I love Mark Hamill as the Joker, but I felt like his voice for the Joker didn't really fit this particular version of the character. But I already did a review on the movie a couple of years ago, so I won't spend too much time talking about it, and also, me and some friends of mine just recently did a retrospective on all the animated Batman films that I should be putting up within the next week, and we spent a half hour talking about the movie. And recently there's also been a novelization of this comic. But yeah, that was my review on Batman the Killing Joke by Alan Moore, and bye.